Hello there, it's Tuesday. We are glad you're tuned to Law Matters, a show that is educative, informative, and offers legal aid solution to what we face on our day-to-day lives. Tonight we're looking into issues surrounding the executive, issues surrounding trade and investment in Kenya, and what are the legal frameworks concerning that particular sector. But before we get into this particular discussion, remember you can send in your questions and feedback on our social media platform at KUTV Kenya on Facebook, at KUTV_Kenya on Twitter, and at KUTV Kenya on YouTube. We'll be sure to sample some of your questions and feedback concerning this particular discussion. But before we debunk this particular topic, let me allow my guest to introduce herself kindly.
Thank you very much. My name is Quinta Otieno. I'm an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, 2 years in practice now. I practice in the projects and infrastructure space, and I'm also an alumnus of KU, class of 2020. So very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Wakili Quinta, for making time. And of course, being an alumni, it's such a privilege to have you on this particular set. Now, when you're looking into the issue of trade and investment and the legal framework surrounding that, kindly give us a perspective on how, major trade investment development has been, since independence or, since it started becoming a thing here in the country.
I think the history of trade and development really would go back to the formation of the World Trade Organization. But to give particular focus to Kenya and in the post-independence era, I think we have seen a lot of growth, particularly from a regional economic perspective, where we've had various regional economic blocks being formed, with Kenya being a member of the EAC, being a member of COMESA. And in addition to that, we've also seen an African-wide effort to enhance trade and investment through the entry into the Africa Free Trade Agreement that aims to open up the trade and movement in goods and services and people and capital in the whole continent. And in addition to that, we have also seen Kenya in its individual country capacity enter into various bilateral investment agreements with other countries. For instance, we have the bilateral investment agreement with Singapore. We have the economic partnership agreements with the EU. We have seen a comprehensive economic partnership agreement being signed with the UAE just last year. So we've seen a lot of growth, and Kenya has generally taken the approach of opening up its borders, which is really good because it has enhanced the flow of foreign direct investments into Kenya.
All right. And when you look into the legal framework that we have had, let's say, for example, since the 2010 Constitution, do you think it is in tandem to the dynamic or the global changes when it comes to trade? Has it enabled the country to benefit more in terms of bilateral trade? And looking into, the partnership that we have signed, especially with the East African Community and AFTA, do you think we have created robust legal framework for that? And what are some of the legal frameworks surrounding that?
I think when we talk about the legal frameworks for trade and investment in Kenya, first of all, we need to go back to Article 2 of the Constitution that provides that international treaties signed by Kenya shall form part of the laws of Kenya. So Kenya is a monist state in that essence. The treaties we sign do not need to be nationalized for them to take effect in Kenya. That means that the treaties signed even at the East Africa community level still form part of the laws of Kenya. So in addition to those treaties, we also have various statutes, such as the Investment Protection Act, that aims to provide various incentives to people who are investing in Kenya. In 2018, we saw the government come up with the government support measures policy just to also enhance investments in the infrastructure space through de-risking the investments that foreign investors are making in the country. So we have seen a lot of growth in the regulatory perspective, both from a trade perspective and from an investment perspective, through the execution of these bilateral investment agreements and through the enactment of certain national statutes like the Investment Protection Act, like the government support measures policy, just various initiatives by government to ensure that we can have that inflow both from outside and from local investors. And as you might know, that the largest export in Kenya is agricultural products. And so Kenya really does need that market outside Kenya for farmers to actually benefit from that, which is why economic partnership agreements, I think, with the EU that allow us to basically export our agricultural products without tariffs and without quotas are particularly helpful in the growth of Kenya from an economic perspective.
All right. Looking into the different regimes now, focusing into the implementation of EPA, allowing the goods and the goods to be exported outside the country. Looking into that perspective and looking at how different regimes have looked into this, we have seen upheavals, say in the agricultural sector, with farmers saying that they want to uproot, their tea and coffee, which has raised concerns in terms of, is it an issue of the legal framework, or is it an issue of how the taxing regime that is being undertaken by the regime that is in place at the moment? How can you say that has unfolded, even with the pact on EPA?
I think I'll answer your question in two ways. The EPA itself and what it's intended to achieve for the country, but then I'll also answer it while focusing on the public interest perspective to trade and investments, and what the public actually feels about some of these agreements that government has entered into. Yeah. So economic partnership agreements were essentially, and this started with the EU and African and Pacific Caribbean countries, and it was intended to basically enhance the growth of least developed countries and developing countries through allowing them to export their products, so everything but arms. And you might note that even the WTO has a GATS framework around it, yeah? So this was intended to allow developing countries and least developed countries to export their products into European markets without facing tariff or non-tariff barriers, yeah? So that was the essence of economic partnership agreements. And over time, people have challenged whether or not they actually benefit these developing countries, because, they also require developing countries and these least developed countries to open up their markets over a certain period of time. So, for example, the example I'd mentioned about the Kenya-EU Economic Partnership Agreement that will require Kenya to progressively open its markets within 25 years to European products. So even as we open up our markets, then eventually what happens is that the locals start to feel the impact of us opening our markets. Remember, these EU products, they're already subsidized at their home country. So by the time they get into the Kenyan market, they already have an advantage against local products. And to just give an example, though this does not directly draw from economic partnership agreements, you remember the China Square debacle, where traders at Nyamakima were complaining about Chinese products coming into the country too cheaply for them to compete. And our government can't afford those subsidies, but those foreign governments can afford the subsidies. So when you open up the market, you create unfair competition, which in turn triggers a local upheaval by traders, by farmers who are arguing that actually, while you think you're benefiting us, who you're really benefiting is those foreign markets, because they already have an advantage. And that just brings me to the public perception around trade and investment, and to what extent the public should be involved. Now, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I wanted to ask whether, looking into that perspective and the issue of the China Square debacle alone, was it an issue of a loophole in the law, or how did the issue, how did the government not see that actually the entry of these foreigners into the market is actually detrimental to the locals?
I wouldn't say it's a loophole in the law. I would just say it's the reality of a developing country. We are not able to afford some of these subsidies. And because we are not able to afford some of these subsidies, it means by the time the retailer is selling the product to the end user, they have to add their own markup, and in turn that product is going to be expensive. Now, if you compare this to a developed country that already provides its manufacturers with subsidies, it means by the time they're exporting these products, the cost is already reduced, because the input into that production was not as high as that of a local producer who didn't have access to subsidies. And we have seen the government try to do something around subsidies, particularly in the agricultural sector. So I think you might recall from the news last year, government was providing subsidies for fertilizer, even though that ended up having its own scandal. But we have seen instances where government tries to subsidize. Just that us being a developing country, we cannot compete with the kind of subsidies the EU and other developed countries and regions can give their citizens. That is where the unfair advantage comes in, not necessarily the legal or regulatory loophole. Yes.
Issues surrounding trade and investment are mostly bilateral, and we have seen this regime being quite, engaging, so to speak, in terms of seeking this bilateral trade. And most recently, we saw the president, go to the United States, and there were talks about the Kenya-US Strategic Trade Investment Partnership. Can you talk to us about that, and what are the merits and the demerits of such particular agreements when it comes to the legal framework that we have in the country, and also for the benefit of the locals, looking into the wider perspective of it?
I think bilateral investment agreements, again, they can be viewed from their advantages and their disadvantages. And if you look at the merits, they usually aim to allow Kenya and the local market to export their goods to international market. Yeah. And we know some of the sectors that we really export a lot of products is the agricultural sector, the horticultural flowers that we're exporting to Europe. Though I know the trade in cotton has gone down, but that used to be a very big export trade. Then we have our EPZs that are always processing and exporting things. So bilateral investment agreements are intended to allow mutual benefit between both countries, but particularly from a Kenyan perspective, is to allow us to export our products to international markets without necessarily being subjected to tariff or non-tariff barriers. And when we talk about tariff barriers, we are talking about things like custom duties and taxes, and non-tariff barriers are things like quotas, things that tell you actually you cannot export more than this, otherwise you'll be subject to certain taxes. So they are essentially intended to allow us to export our products without unnecessary hurdles. However, in terms of their disadvantages, number one, we've talked about the unfair advantage it creates when our markets open up to these developed countries. And number two, there's the proliferation of these regional economic blocks. So, and some of these advantages in those agreements. So you'll find that Kenya is a member of the EAC, and yet it has undertaken that it will not provide any other country a more favorable treatment than it provides another member of the EAC. And then Kenya enters into a bilateral investment agreement where it undertakes to provide certain advantages to a country that's not a member state of the EAC. So then you'll have those conflicts, that have been pointed out by various scholars around this proliferation, where we're all trying to enter into several bilateral investment agreements, while at the same time trying to max out the advantages of these regional economic blocks, which is why you might have seen some academics arguing that Africa should actually be negotiating as a bloc, to increase its bargaining power and to avoid issues around proliferation, of these regional blocks and the various undertakings in these bilateral investment agreements. So I think those are the two main demerits, but certainly opening up our markets is advantageous for a developing country. I mean, we have seen a lot of growth by having investors come into Kenya, and we have also seen a lot of growth by having our locals being able to export their products.
All right. And I wanted us to talk about the issue. We were coming to the issue of regional blocks. And there's been quite a debate when it comes to, to the East African Community Regional Bloc, and to point into people viewing the country as, the big brother who appears to be some sort of a bully compared to, the others, Tanzania and Uganda, and of course, the Eastern African Bloc. But looking into the EAC alone, do you think it has been quite, viable to the country? Does it give us an upper advantage from your view, and having looked into issues surrounding this? And I know you've mentioned about it a bit. Are regional blocks the way when it comes to trade and investment, or do you think that maybe they hinder the growth when it comes to trade and investment?
I think regional blocks certainly enhance trade and investment. And even the FCFTA recognized the importance of the various regional blocks we have in the continent, because now you're dealing with a block that has already come together, that is already open to the idea of opening up its markets. So certainly they enhance trade and investment. But speaking to the EAC situation, for the longest time, and as you have correctly pointed out, Kenya has been viewed as the big brother, mostly because of its diplomatic strength, its strategic location. So we have the Indian Ocean, and we know that various landlocked countries actually import things through Kenya from the Indian Ocean all the way to Malaba and to the various other East African countries. So we have the advantage of a strategic location, and also we have the advantage of being viewed as a country with a strong diplomatic presence in the region. And also we have the advantage of being viewed as the digital hub of East Africa. But To perhaps point out a more controversial view, in the recent past, people have been wondering whether that position that Kenya has held for the longest time is being toppled. And that's mostly because the various legal measures that the government has put in place that are sometimes viewed as disincentivizing investors compared to our regional sisters like Tanzania, that is now becoming more open to opening up its market to other people. So people have in the recent past at least attempted to question the place of Kenya as the leader from a regional bloc perspective, particularly if you take into account the 2024 finance bill protests, if you take into account some of the tax measures that are being proposed around the manufacturing sector that resulted into big companies closing up in Kenya, people are starting to question the idea of Kenya as the big brother in East Africa community. But, and even more interestingly, we as Kenyans sometimes wonder if we are giving more than what we are getting in the East African community. So for instance, an advocate from Uganda can practice in Kenya. I cannot practice in Uganda. An advocate from Tanzania can be admitted in Kenya. I cannot go and practice in Tanzania. So if you even look at the professional services, Kenya is opening up faster than its regional sisters. So sometimes people have wondered, are we really giving more than we are getting in this regard? But yeah, those are some of the thoughts I would have around the East African community and the place of Kenya.
And is it an issue of not actually, doing a retrospection or doing a sort of evaluation to see, okay, what are we getting in return? Because previously, in the previous years, we have seen the other countries, the likes of Uganda, that have traditionally used the Mombasa port as a point of entry, threatened to use Tanzania as a port of entry. And there's been rhetorics that most landlocked countries have now, taken their entry points to Tanzania because they feel Kenya is becoming unfavorable. But at the same time, as you pointed out, some of the services we have opened up for the other countries to be open to practice in Kenya or actually find a home in this country, but we're not getting the same. So is it an issue of us not scrutinizing and seeing what are we getting in return? Or is it an issue of us feeling like, okay, we are the big brother and not having, an evaluation of some sort to see what are we getting in return?
I don't think it's a lack of evaluation, because if you go back to the EAC Treaty and the relevant protocols, member states are supposed to gradually open up services. They're supposed to allow free movement of goods. They're supposed to allow free movement of services. Sometimes these barriers are just effected by other member states from a protectionist standpoint. So for instance, one would argue that perhaps the legal practice in Kenya has perhaps progressed to a certain extent. If we have them come to this country, they are going to create unnecessary competition for the locals. So sometimes it's just a protectionist standpoint, not necessarily that Kenya did not scrutinize, because those undertakings are there. It's just that Kenya is implementing those undertakings, and perhaps these other countries are feeling maybe opening up too much would compromise the locals. And maybe sometimes Kenya also needs to think about that. Perhaps opening up too much might compromise. But then again, in my view, there's a bigger advantage to opening up than to closing your borders. Because when you open up, people come in. When investors come in, you create job opportunities. There is economic growth. I mean, just last year alone, there are very big public-private partnership projects that the government achieved financial close on. So, and that's because you have opened up your borders. And some of these projects, government can't do it on its own because it doesn't have the capital. And when you open up your borders and people come in, you're creating employment. So in my view, there's always an advantage to opening up, particularly for a developing country. There's always an advantage in opening up, even though in certain instances, your locals might feel like they're getting the short end of the stick.
All right, thank you so much, Okili. We'll have to take our first break on that particular point. But do stay with us. We'll be back with more, including the issue of public-private partnership when it comes to investment, and also issues surrounding public participation. See you on the other side of this break.
Hi, my name is Stella Tioi.
Jina langu naitwa Okemwa Mokwa James.
This is Mandela Gaya.
Ugonjwa ulipokuja ulichukua siku 3 ukaniweka in coma. 20 wamezikwa, 2 ndio wako hai.
I don't even know how it feels to see.
I feel like I cannot express myself well the way somebody who can walk can actually express themselves.
Ilichukua muda mwingi mrefu tena mpana ili kuikubali kwamba mimi siwezi tembea tena.
I've come to actually accept myself.
Ukijaribu kumsimamisha mtu umwambie tafadhali nionyeshe njia,
They find it quite strange talking to you.
We should just make schools integrated
Inclusive setups.
by providing the right facilities. Ni nguzo na uso wa jamii. Kupanda shuka akawa tuzo, ukakamavu wake ukatii na kumfanya mwenye bidii. Kwa machozi na makeke akabaini jinsi ya kuwini. Huyu ni mwanamke ngangari kwa jinsi alivyo ng'ari. Mimi ni mwanamke mwake. Usikose kutazama kipindi cha mwanamke mwake nami Caroline Kimweli.
You're watching Law Matters tonight, looking into the issue of trade and investments in Kenya. We are having Advocate Quinta giving us a perspective on that, and on this second segment of this particular show, looking into the public-private partnership when it comes to investment in the country. So, recently, I think since Uhuru's regime, people have been quite, woke when it comes to public-private partnership. What can you say concerning that? What are some of the legal frameworks on that, given that recently we witnessed some sort of changes when it comes to public-private partnership? What can you say concerning the growth when it comes to investment in that particular route?
Thank you so much, Irene, for that. I think we need to make it clear that investments in Kenya can take various routes. Yeah. Investment in the infrastructure sector would typically take the public-private partnership route, or there would be a procurement under the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act. But most of them would happen under the public-private partnership regime. Mm-hmm. And the public-private partnership regime is governed by the Public-Private Partnership Act 2021. Mm-hmm. And the primary purpose of public-private partnerships is to allow government to do big projects that it doesn't have money for.
Yeah.
To put it simply.
Yeah.
So government is supposed to ensure you have roads. The government doesn't have immediate cash for the road. So what does government do? It seeks private investors who are willing to put in the money and build the road on behalf of government, and then get a return over a long period of time. So for instance, 20 years. Yeah. So that's typically what public-private partnership entails. It's a private party undertaking to provide a government function on behalf of government, subject to the private party, of course, receiving a certain consideration that would typically include perhaps a user fee, so like the toll fees you pay when you use the expressway, or perhaps a combination of a payment from government and now those user fees. Yeah, so that's how typically public-private partnerships would happen, and they usually happen in sectors like transport, they happen in the energy sector, they happen in the digital sector. So there are various sectors that are capital intensive that usually require such arrangements.
All right, but do you think, from where you sit in looking that this is an investment being done by Kenyans, and the government's doing it on behalf of Kenyans, do you think there's value for money at the end of it all? Because sometimes we have seen projects that have been termed as, dead projects. Others have been termed as ghost. I'm trying to find the word. I can't remember the word that has been used previously by political parties. White elephant projects, so to speak. Thank you. Do you think there is value for money on that breadth, given that it is a regime sitting down and saying these are some of the investment projects that we'll get into in terms of public-private? But when you look at what Kenyans will pay in terms of taxes to repay back the money that has been invested here, people have questioned the value for money in that particular aspect?
Firstly, the value for money preposition in any investment is a very interesting topic. But remember, for us to even attract private investors, both local and international, you need to show them that they'll get a return on their money.
Yeah.
No one is coming to build a road from Mombasa to Nairobi and not get a return. Yeah? No one is coming to build a big power plant and not get a return.
Yes.
These projects are capital intensive. Typically, the private investor also needs to take a loan in order to do that project. Yeah?
Yeah.
The government doesn't have the funds at hand. So obviously, the investor is going to require a return. And because they're recovering their investment over a protracted period of time, you would find that that return has been spread, say, over 25 years. And the percentage will be slightly higher compared to a scenario where government is paying you back in 2 years because you have finance cost for the length of the project. So the investment return for an investor is not the issue. And I don't think Kenyans are crying about an investor being given a fair return on their investment. I think the big problem is the lack of accountability and transparency when it comes to these projects. And the fact that most of these projects are never seen to completion. I think those are the two main problems. It's not that the investor will make X amount, obviously provided the amount is justifiable and not outrightly exorbitant. It's the fact that there is a lack of accountability and transparency when it comes to some of these projects. And that brings us to the interesting question around public participation in investment projects, in procurement projects in Kenya. To what extent should the public be involved? Is it to the same level as when Parliament is trying to pass a new law? Certainly not. Certainly not. When Parliament wants to pass a new regulatory measure, they go to the people.
Yes.
They ask the people for their feedback. They ask them for their comments. As to whether those comments are eventually actioned, that's up for debate. But they usually go to the people, or at least they are supposed to go to the people. But when it comes to a public-private partnership project, remember that project is premised on the Public-Private Partnership Act. And that act underwent public participation. So the methods of procurement under that act have already, quote unquote, been approved by the people. And therefore, one would wonder, is it unfair for the public to ask government to subject projects that are being procured in accordance with the laws they had passed to public participation? And that's an interesting question that the Court of Appeal has had to grapple with, particularly from a procurement perspective under the Public Procurement Act. And we can draw those principles to public-private partnership agreements. For example, in the NASA 2017 appeal decision around how IEBC kits were procured. And one of the things that NASA raised was that IEBC was supposed to subject this procurement to public participation. And the court said that actually how public participation occurs in procurement is through tendering.
Also, that is an avenue.
That is the form of public participation because it's an invitation to the public to submit their bids to this tender. So for procurement purposes, how public participation is supposed to occur is not the typical public participation that is expected for lawmaking. It's public participation in the form of tendering. So when the procuring entity or the contracting authority, in the case of a public-private partnership agreement, publishes their request for proposal to the public to submit bids, then that is what is considered public participation. But remember, under both the Public-Private Partnership Act and the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act, there are provisions for direct procurement. And direct procurement means I don't go out to the public, I go to one individual.
So where does public participation come in that?
It doesn't. There is no public participation for direct procurement. But that is why for government to engage in direct procurement, there's a very high threshold under the respective statutes. So it has to be something. So for instance, in the case of a public-private partnership agreement, I know there's a great deal of debate around certain large infrastructure projects are being procured. Admittedly, it needs to be clear that that project had not yet gotten to the procurement stage. It was still at the proposal stage. What would happen, even in the case of a privately initiated proposal, is that once that proposal is approved, then government would consider, is this a proposal that if we took out to the public, we would get better value for money? If the government is of the view that this proposal, even though it was initiated by a private contractor in their own capacity, would get better value for money if taken out to competitive tender, then it should be taken out to competitive tender. But if the government is of the view that actually what this person is proposing is unique, it's something we have not done in this market, it's something that these people have a proven history of doing even in other markets, then they can proceed and procure that particular private party directly. And so in the cases of direct procurement, you usually do not have public participation because it is not going out to tender.
Okay, and also in the case of privately initiated procurement, the government has the wherewithal to see whether they will open it to the public in terms of competitive tender or not.
Yes,
okay.
That is correct. And imagine a scenario where all projects that were being done in Kenya were being taken to public participation. We would never move.
Yeah.
We would never move. That is not to say that there shouldn't be accountability and transparency, by the way. That is to just consider and break down the issue around public participation in such projects. Okay. But that does not do away with accountability and transparency, which is why typically there's a requirement to publish the public-private partnership engagements that government has entered into. Government is required to publish that information. Okay. Yeah. So sometimes this is not published, sometimes the follow-up is not done correctly, but I guess that is the disconnect between the law as it is and what happens in reality.
Implementation.
Yeah? And because that accountability and transparency should come from the fact that, number one, you have published this to the public, that I have entered into a public-private partnership agreement with person X for the delivery of Y.
Okay.
Yeah? So the public can know that this project is in existence. From an accountability perspective, the expectation is that government, when entering into this agreement, is not just giving away public money, that it has the relevant resources to be able to monitor implementation. Now, sometimes there's a shortfall of that, which is why you will find certain projects that have become white elephant projects.
At the end of the day. But when we now look into the issue of what some have termed as government focus area in terms of what a regime is doing, there has been a question whereby we have seen, people move to court to block some of the, flagship projects that a government has. For example, the housing project has been something that has been, subjected to litigation in courts. And the president has previously argued that a manifesto, which is what people actually vote for when they go to the ballot, is an act of public participation, and therefore it should not be subjected to more litigation when the manifesto is being implemented. From a legal perspective, when you look into the issue of, because this is around trade and investment, it's all about investment, when you look into some of this government focus area, should it be subjected to further public participation, or is it an issue of a regime now sitting down and thinking what is best for the people in terms of investment?
I think we need to think about public participation from the constitutional basis.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the national values and principles, right, under the Constitution. Public participation is also required in lawmaking. Yeah, which means the government should not necessarily act in total disregard of the people.
Okay.
But then again, remember, Kenya is a representative democracy. Yeah. So even though we are arguing that government must subject everything to public participation, there's also the other school of thought that posits that actually, because you're enacting these laws through your represented your elected representatives, they're speaking for you. Yeah. But then again, the Constitution goes ahead to say you must still involve the people. But when it comes to a government manifesto, I think we can all agree that that statement is incorrect. Yeah. A campaign document is not public participation. It's simply a promise to your voters that once elected, you will endeavor to do X, Y, Z. And I don't think some of these things are being challenged because they were in the manifesto of the president. I think most of these things are being challenged from a constitutionality standpoint. Yeah, and even if you look at the Affordable Housing Act, yeah, it's a constitutionality argument. It's not necessarily a question of the president and the manifesto. It's more like the enabling legislation. Did it undergo public participation? Yeah, but then again, and what we have said around public participation and investments, one needs to take a very critical view. Obviously, from a legislative standpoint, you must subject legislation to public participation in accordance with the Constitution. But once the law has been passed, unless it's been declared unconstitutional, the government should have the bandwidth to implement the law.
Okay.
Because if you insist that a law that has been passed and has not been declared unconstitutional must still come back to the public, then it means you're creating further hindrances in government implementing their projects. But we must also admit that where does this stem from? It stems from the lack of trust people have in government.
Yes.
And that lack of trust essentially ties to accountability and transparency. People argue that actually we have seen this project here for the past 9 years, so what are you doing for us when you tell us you're bringing in a new project? Yeah, so all these things must be looked at in totality.
All right. Now, let's now move into the issue of investment with the view of private investors and, the issue of tax incentives and the government policies surrounding that. When you look into our markets, let's look into Kenya as a market. When you look into our market and the tax incentives that have been there, have they offered a conducive environment for investors to be in the country? There has been, a debate that, the finance bills that we have had since this regime got into place, they have not been quite favorable to the extent that some investors have decided to close shop and, go to the neighboring countries. Looking at it, analyzing it, is it favorable from where you sit?
I think the answer to that is very simple. If a government introduces a raft of tax measures that make it impossible for you to operate, you're going to close shop. For instance, in the finance bill, we saw certain tax incentives for the manufacturing sector were being proposed to be deleted. We saw certain tax incentives relating to the e-mobility sector, to the tourism sector, government proposing to introduce 16% VAT where it had previously exempted those sectors. Obviously, for some of these sectors where an investor came in with the understanding that these are the benefits in this sector, and then a year later the benefits have been removed, that investor will close shop. Yeah. So when some of these changes come into play, and they come into play so suddenly, and it's a big jump from where the initial position was, obviously it negatively impacts the operations of an investor, and they will close shop. That is the reality. If I was not paying VAT, and tomorrow you say I'm paying 16% VAT, and then you say in addition to the 16% VAT, there are 50 other deductions you're adding, I'm not making profit. So I'll close shop.
The question has been, how then do they create a balance? Because the government is coming from a point of, we need to make revenues for us to sustain this particular economy. We don't want to borrow anymore. But at the same time, the sharp increase is actually affecting, the stability of these companies in the country. How then do they, create some sort of a balance so that we sort of have a win-win situation in these scenarios?
I think creating that balance is quite difficult, but not completely unattainable.
Okay.
So I think one of the things we need to point out is what is Kenya currently grappling with that has resulted into these aggressive measures by government to increase tax revenues? The debt problem.
Yeah.
We have a lot of debt. We can't sustain our debt. The debt needs to be paid back. There are certain questions around how the debt has been used to develop the country, but we won't delve into that. But we have debt, and we have to pay the debt. And that's why government is telling people, for us to pay the debt, we need to increase the taxes. But I think where Kenyans are having a problem is you're increasing the taxes, but we are not seeing the output. And for most of these companies, they came into this market with the idea that they will be incurring these costs, they will break even at this point, and suddenly those costs are changing. So for that investor, it's also very difficult to create a balance. And I would argue that the only way to create a balance is perhaps to have a progressive increase, to offer tax holidays to upcoming sectors like the e-mobility sectors, to offer exemptions to certain strategic investments. So there are those investments that government wants to put particular focus in. And I think from the budget policy statement, some of those sectors are water, energy, transport. So for those sectors that government wants to put strategic focus on, then perhaps government can introduce certain incentives for those sectors. And even for those upcoming sectors like e-mobility, then you introduce tax incentives to incentivize investors to come into the market. For the other more established sectors, then the government has to ask itself, if I increase these taxes to 50%, who will stay in the market?
I think.
And I would rather have someone in the market than have no one in the market.
Yeah, I think it's a tough balancing act, regardless of how you see it, but it's an act that has to be made regardless. All right, with that particular point, we'll have to take our second break, but do stay with us. We'll be having the tail segment of this particular discussion, looking into the incentives that, the common mwananchi, is sort of enjoying at the moment and whether they are sustainable, and also looking into some of the reforms that should be made in trade and investment. Do stay with us. See you on the other side of this break. Okay, time has moved so fast.
I am a project manager in this consortium. Keep watching cutting-edge research at Kenyatta University Television.
They are powerful and influential. They make decisions in politics, education, finance, agriculture, health, sports, and all aspects of human life. But the impact of their decisions falls on you, the common citizen. KUTV Primetime News Thursday. We ask bold questions and pursue answers to the core to bring you closer to the story. We couldn't have it any other way. Join me, Auma Evans, as I raise matters of social concern to raise your voice from the background to the foreground.
Badala ya kutafuta kazi, tunaweza kuanzisha miradi yetu ambayo ingetusaidia kubadilisha maisha ya wazazi wetu.
Kwa vijana wenzangu, wengi hawana kazi, lakini ikiwa sisi wenyewe tutajiamini, tunaweza kujiajiri wenyewe.
Afrika kwa kweli tuna mahitaji ambayo ukiyasuluhisha unaweza kuathiri watu kwenye bara hili.
Bila woga, watu huwa na uzalishaji zaidi, wanajawa na ujasiri, wanakuwa wabunifu na wanakuwa wenye maarifa.
Niliamua kuacha kazi. Hata kama sitafanikiwa, nitakuwa nimejaribu, nitakuwa najua haiwezekani.
Hakuna kitu cha ajabu hapa. Kila anayepata ufanisi hufanya kazi usiku na mchana.
Kitu kitakusukuma na kuwezesha kupata maarifa ambayo hukuwa nayo.
Tunajaribu kutengeneza kitu kitakachopita mipaka ya nchi hii.
Ikiwa unataka kubadilisha ulimwengu, anza na nyumbani.
Are you an aspiring media practitioner, a graduate, or you just want to advance your skills in television production? Then welcome to Kenyatta University, where education meets innovation. KUTV, the premier university television station in Kenya, is now offering short courses in TV studio, field technical operations, and video editing. Through these courses, you will acquire hands-on skills on camera operations, media production, lighting techniques, audio-visual editing, and sound and visual control, and how to operate key equipment in modern TV control room. Enroll today at KUTV and discover your full potential in cutting-edge TV broadcasting. Graduates of these courses will receive professional certificates. For more information, visit our offices at KUTV Studios or call us on 020-870-4252 or 020-870-4255 or SMS us on 0739-110-544. KUTV, a new experience.
Thank you for staying with us. You're watching Low Matters on the tail end of this particular discussion tonight, looking into the trade and investment here in the country and what the government has done so far. So, Advocate Quinta, we looked into the private sector, but this particular government has been quite vocal when it comes to the bottom-up, pillars, and, Kenyans have resonated it with the common mwananchi. So, can you talk to us about the incentives that surround that particular, economic model, so to speak, and whether it has been viable to be felt by the common mwananchi as it is?
Thanks, Irene, for that question. I think the current regime campaigned primarily on the backing of the hustler notion. Yeah. And so this bottom-up economic transformation agenda, to put it in a very simplistic way, was intended to, invest most resources at the base of the pyramid so that most people can benefit, because a majority of us are really at the base of the pyramid. Very few people fall in the top 1%. Yeah. So it was intended to basically benefit the common mwananchi, and the pillars that the government was working with include agriculture. And for agriculture, we saw that one of the incentives government introduced was subsidized fertilizer. And subsidized fertilizer, we know, was also accompanied by a scandal in that sector, whereby farmers were getting bags of sand instead of fertilizer. But the intention was for government to subsidize the cost of production for farmers in order to enhance agricultural production and output in the country. The second pillar is the medium and small enterprises, basically the micro, small and medium-sized enterprises in the country who mostly struggle with access to funds. And so what the government was trying to do is bringing the funds to these SMEs so that they can have access to cheap facilities to enable them to basically run their businesses, because of most of businesses that fall in this category had that challenge. And what the government did in this regard was to introduce the Hustler Fund. I think from the budget policy statement, they were saying to date they've disbursed up to 60 billion shillings towards the Hustler Fund. But obviously we know the concerns around the Hustler Fund as well, the issues around repayment of this debt and whether now the country is just losing money to what is called the Hustler Fund. I think a couple of days ago we also saw in the news that 32 million shillings had been disbursed to people who were not born at the time they got the disbursement. So we also saying that some of these incentives are coming with their own challenges. Then we have housing. So I think at the moment government is presently constructing 124,000 houses that are in the construction phase, if I'm not wrong, and it's being funded primarily by the housing levy. That has also had its own controversy, with people arguing whether affordable housing is really affordable and whether someone from perhaps a low-income background will afford a house for 1 million shillings, and whether there needs to be distinction between social housing and affordable housing, because what we are calling affordable housing is actually housing for the middle class. Then you also have the digital and creative economy. And we must admit that the government has really tried to ramp up their efforts in the digital sector. That we must admit. We must give credit where it's due. And it has done through this. It has done this through things like public Wi-Fi. How effective it is a matter of question. But we have seen efforts in transforming the digital and creative economy. We are seeing more and more creatives being given platforms at the national level. So we have seen some effort go into the digital and creative economy, and of course there is healthcare as well.
All right. With that, Advocate Quinta, in this show we allow the audience to ask questions concerning this particular discussion, and I'll draw it to them at this particular point.
Thank you for this opportunity. Eugene Bill is the name. I have 3 legal issues, Advocate, and you have touched on the regional trade. I would like to seek the clarification about talked about Kenya. How does Kenya membership in regional trade bloc like the East African Community and the African Continental Free Trade Area impact its trade policies? And the second question, it's about technology.
Sorry, because I don't have a pen. Maybe I can answer.
Yeah, sure.
So how does the membership of Kenya in the regional economic bloc and the continental economic bloc impact its internal trade policies?
Yes.
So firstly, and I think as I previously mentioned, Kenya is a monist state. So to the extent it has signed and ratified a treaty, that treaty is part of the laws of Kenya. Yeah, that's on the first part. On the second part, the question always comes down to how advantageous is it for Kenya to be a member of the regional economic bloc or the continental economic bloc? Yeah, because that is really what informs trade policy. Trade policy is informed by your economic growth. Where you're projecting your economic growth in the next couple of years, and how does being a member of this bloc enhance your economic growth? I don't think we have fully explored the Africa Free Continental Trade Area, given that it became operational only recently. I think, was it 2022 2022 or 2023, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we have fully explored the advantages that we could get, but we have certainly seen some countries starting to open up their borders through certain measures. For instance, Ghana recently announced visa-free entry for all African countries. South Africa recently agreed to allow Kenya to go there visa-free. So we are starting to see gradual opening of borders, and it's advantageous to Kenya because we will be able to export products there. Yeah. And that inevitably comes down to now our trade policies and how they tie into this regional growth.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The next question.
Okay, the next question is about the small enterprises. How does the government help these small enterprises to come up from a position where you see that as much as the government is trying to bring the technology to suit the person who is supposed to export his product, there's a lot of shenanigans that has been raised by the people, saying that at the local places, there are some people who they might really have some of the problems on how they can be educated. And I want to seek the clarification. How does the government can come up with allegations so that they can tackle this issue in a very penumbration and tactful OTC?
Thank you for that question. So basically, if I'm getting you correctly, it's how government can help these small and medium-sized enterprises benefit from these trade policies. Exactly. Yeah. So firstly, small and medium-sized enterprises typically struggle with things like access to finance. Yeah, and we are seeing efforts around the Hustler Fund, how, notwithstanding the challenges it has faced. But secondly, there's the lack of information that you have talked about. And how lack of information can be solved is by going to the people. Unfortunately, there's no other way around it. Government has to work with the counties, it has to work with community-based organizations to go to the people. It has to work with cooperative societies. So you have seen counties, mostly around the central region, that have really benefited from these cooperative societies, even in terms of local trade. Yeah, these milk cooperative societies, we have seen these cooperative societies even around exportation of avocados. So it has to go down to the people by liaising with the community-based organizations and these cooperative societies in order to disseminate the information to the people.
All right. So the third questions.
Okay. So my name is Motaha Wanjiro. I have a question. How does the government aim to balance the interests of the common wananchi with the parties in which it engages with in those public-private partnerships? Since a good example is the expressway. We see that the sole purpose of creating roads is to decongest Nairobi and enable traffic to flow well. But on the other hand, they are charging to use the road. So how does the government aim to balance the interests, since at the end of the day, these institutions should, or they ought to make profits out of the same, and also the common wananchi ought to benefit from this project since it's part of infrastructure in the country. So how does those two balance?
Can you take one more?
Yeah, that's fine.
Do you have another question?
No.
All right.
That's a very interesting question. How do you balance the interest of the private investor vis-a-vis the interest of the common wananchi? And the answer is simple. This project must be beneficial to the common wananchi while ensuring that the investor also gets a fair return. Okay. Yeah, that's really the simple and straightforward answer. And I don't think you can say that the expressway should be free, because then you won't really be solving the problem that you're solving for. Because here you want to ensure people get to the places they are going to as fast as possible, while at the same time solving for decongestion. Yeah. So the toll road system is not a problem, in my view. What would be a problem is if the charges were so exorbitant that any common citizen would not be able to afford it.
Okay. So the final question, because of time, make it precise.
Okay. So, I'm Jonathan Kisula. Yes, I have a question to Quinta. And number one is, how do in the PPPs, most of these projects are done by foreign investors. So do we have a mechanism to balance? Because from what I have seen in most of these agreements, they have an arbitration clause where the arbitration will be done privately, whereas this is public money. So how does the government balance these two? And do the local courts have, can the citizens access local courts first before going for arbitration outside the country? Then the second question is on on sanitary and phytosanitary standards. You see, recently, when the president was advocating for vaccination of the animals, he was arguing that abroad, there's need to ensure that the cows are vaccinated. I mean, they meet the global standards. Whereas here in Kenya, the local mwananchi is not satisfied with this vaccination. So, how do we balance to ensure that we do global trade, and at the same time we ensure that we satisfy the needs of the common mwananchi?
Thank you very much for those questions. The first one was on dispute resolution and this public-private partnership agreements. I think you cannot, for a foreign investor, one of the things they look out for in a dispute resolution provision is the neutrality of the venue. If you subject a foreign investor to local dispute resolution mechanisms, they're likely not going to sign that contract because in their view, and what they anticipate is that local courts will most likely be skewed in favor of the government. Yeah? So that is why a foreign investor would really never settle for local arbitration, and rightfully so. And that's why even our Arbitration Act recognizes the concept of foreign arbitral awards. And remember, there are grounds for setting aside these awards. So it's not that the public is completely unprotected in this arbitration. If at the point of enforcement, this foreign investor would have to go to our local courts, make an application for the enforcement of the arbitral award, which the government can also challenge on account of public policy, on account of a raft of issues set out in Section 37 of the Arbitration Act, including that the dispute was not within the ambit of the arbitration agreement. So it's not that there's lack of protection. It's just that for a foreign investor, a neutrality of the venue is crucial for dispute resolution. Okay. Yes. And in relation to the second question around this phytosanitary measures, sorry, I struggle with the pronunciation of that term, and how government can ensure that they are not unfavorable to the citizens. I think it's important for citizens to also interrogate what government says. And how, and I think that's what I'll say, yeah? And how it links to the various undertaking under the multilateral trade agreements. Yeah. It's important for us as citizens to particularly interrogate these things. And we must remember that even this implementation, these multilateral trade agreements are not intended to be to the extreme disadvantage of the locals, which is why it's important for locals and citizens to particularly interrogate the undertakings that government has entered into, and their implications on the citizens.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Advocate Quinta, for that perspective. Of course, trade investment is quite a big subject and a bit controversial to some extent, especially when it comes to public-private partnership. But because of time, we'll have to, wind it there. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you, Irene, for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. That's it for our discussion today surrounding trade and investment. Because of time, we'll wind it up there. Remember, you can send in your feedback and questions. We can continue to have it in our social media platforms at KUTV Kenya on Facebook, KUTV_Kenya on Twitter, and KUTV Kenya on YouTube. My name is Irene Mwangi. Have yourself a splendid night.
Are you an aspiring media practitioner, a graduate, or you just want to advance your skills in television production? Then welcome to Kenyatta University, where education meets innovation. KUTV, the premier university television station in Kenya, is now offering short courses in TV studio, field technical operations, and video editing. Through these courses, you will acquire hands-on skills on camera operations, media production, lighting techniques, audiovisual editing, and sound and visual control, and how to operate key equipment in modern TV control room. Enroll today at KUTV and discover your full potential in cutting-edge TV broadcasting. Graduates of these courses will receive professional certificates. For more information, visit our offices at KUTV Studios or call us on 020-870-4252 or 020-870-4255 or SMS us on 0739-110-544. KUTV, a new experience.
Ni nguzo na uso wa jamii. Kupanda shuka akawa tuzo, ukakamavu wake ukatii na kumfanya mwenye bidii. Kwa machozi na makeke akabaini jinsi ya kuwini. Huyu ni mwanamke ngangari kwa jinsi alivyo ng'ari. Mimi ni mwanamke mwake. Usikose kutazama kipindi cha mwanamke mwake nami Caroline Kimwele.
Wengi wetu walikuwa shuleni bado, wengine wetu tulikuwa tumemaliza shule.
Unaenda shuleni na kitabu chako cha vibonzo cha Planet Comic na kuonesha marafiki zako. Kimsingi ni vibonzo vya kufurahisha kwa sababu ni hadithi kuhusu shujaa mkuu ambaye anajaribu kuzuia uchafuzi wa mazingira.
Tulijawa na furaha kwa sababu tulikuwa na ujuzi unaopata shuleni, ujuzi tunaoita wa kimsingi. Hivyo tuliamua badala ya kutafuta kazi, tunaweza kuanzisha miradi yetu ambayo ingetusaidia kubadilisha maisha ya wazazi wetu, jinsi tulivyoona familia zetu tukikua, kwa sababu kwa wengi wetu familia zetu ziko kule mashambani.
Kuna msemo mmoja kwenye kitabu hiki ambao ninauenzi kwa sana. Tukiziunganisha nguvu zetu, Captain Planet. Kwa hivyo kimsingi ni njia ya kuunganisha nguvu zetu kutatua masuala kama vile uchafuzi na kubadilika kwa hali ya hewa.
Wamenihamasisha kweli. Nimeona jinsi walivyosambaza umeme kwa kutumia nyaya na kutumia nguvu za sola na vinginevyo. Ndipo nilipojiuliza iwapo naweza buni kitu sawia na mfumo huo wa umeme.
Tuligundua kwamba kuna upungufu fulani katika ukulima, na sio kitengo cha ukulima tu, pia kwenye sekta ya teknolojia kwa ujumla. Ndio maana tunakiita kitengo cha teknolojia ukulima.
60% ya mashamba Afrika yanaweza kulimwa. Kwa hivyo tuna shamba kubwa sana kuweza kulisha ulimwengu. Kwa hivyo nadhani viwanda vinavyoendelea na ubunifu katika vitengo vya ukulima vitakuwa na ufanisi mkubwa sana. Vitafanikiwa sana hivi karibuni.
Naitwa William Luinda, mwanzilishi mwenza na mkurugenzi mtendaji wa kampuni ya Acorian. Kwa nini Acorian? Acorian kwa lugha yetu inamaanisha mkulima. Hivyo sababu haswa ya kuanzisha Acorian na kuita Acorian ni tulihisi kwamba dhamani yetu na kile tunachojaribu kuwapa watu kinahusiana na ukulima.
Mimi ni Tim Cloud Mao, mwanzilishi mwenza na afisa mkuu wa bidhaa wa Lori Systems, jukwaa la mtandao la usafirishaji barani Afrika.
Lengo la Lori ni kupunguza bei ya bidhaa barani Afrika.
Sababu ambayo vifaa huku barani ni bei ghali ukilinganisha na kwingine ni kwa sababu ya ukosefu wa ufanisi katika usafirishaji. Na usafirishaji barani umekosa ufanisi kwa sababu ya ukosefu wa uratibu unaofaa.
Bwana, nilianzisha Kwanda Lab. Habari, jina langu ni Israel, nimetoka Kwanda Lab. Mimi ni mwanzilishi mwenza.
Haya 1 2 3. Haya 1 2 3.
Jina langu ni Ndekezi James na nafanya kazi na Israel Shimwe Kwanda Lab. Sisi sote ni wanzilishi.
Hapa tunasambaza umeme bila nyaya kutoka sehemu moja hadi nyingine. Hebu nikizungumza kwenye picha.
Jina langu ni Desmond Koni, mkurugenzi mtendaji Complete Farmer. Baba yangu aliaga dunia na nikarithi shamba lake la nanasi. Kama kijana wa kwanza kwa familia, nilikuwa najaribu kutengeneza shamba litupe mapato kabla